Greek attitude towards the landing of troops in Salonika was ambiguous and uncertain. The Prime Minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, secretly welcomed the plan, though, for form's sake, he registered a formal protest. King Constantine, on the other hand, who had succeeded his father George 2 years before and was married to the Kaiser's sister, was violently opposed on the grounds that until the Bulgarian army actually crossed the frontier, the presence of foreign troops on Greek soil would be a violation of Greek neutrality. As for the Greeks themselves, they were overwhelmingly on the side of the king. They had no desire for an allied presence, feeling that they were being forced against their will into the war. The result was what came to be known as the National Schism, and Venizelos was forced to resign. It is always a mistake for constitutional monarchs to meddle in foreign policy. This time it was calamitous. The king now opened secret talks with the Germans, and on 23 May 1916, on his orders, the Greek army surrendered the frontier castle of Rupel, allowing German and Bulgarian troops to overrun eastern Macedonia. Kavala, too, was ordered to surrender, its Greek garrison being carted off to Germany as prisoners of war. Where, shouted Venizelos in Parliament, where at least are your 30 pieces of silver? It was not perhaps the most diplomatic preface to a last appeal to the king to join the Allies before it was too late. Predictably, Constantine turned a deaf ear. For the expeditionary force, the situation was becoming more and more impossible. From the day of its arrival, it had found itself extremely unwelcome, being obliged to camp several miles outside the city, while the consuls of the enemy remained at liberty within. That winter, the Serbs had been driven back to the Adriatic, and Serbia had been occupied. What the Allies asked themselves were they meant to be doing. It was then that the French commander in Salonika, General Maurice Serret, had taken the law into his own hands, putting all the enemy consuls and agents under arrest and imprisoning them in the castle while simultaneously taking possession of another fortress guarding the entrance to the bay. Now the gloves were off. The Allied powers officially demanded the demobilization of the Greek army, the dissolution of parliament, and the dismissal of the government. In September 1916, Venizelos slipped away to his native Crete, where he raised a revolt against the king. He then returned to Greece and established a provisional government in Thessalonica, which the Allies recognized a month later. In December, the British and French, their demands still unfulfilled, landed troops at Piraeus in an attempt to force the king to surrender his armaments and munitions. This, however, proved a mistake. The Greeks fought back, and the royal palace was bombarded by the French fleet. Venizelos, understandably but quite unjustifiably, was blamed and on 26 December was solemnly excommunicated by the Archbishop of Athens. The Allies then put southern Greece under a blockade and in June 1917 demanded the abdication of the king, the French reinforcing the demand by landing troops at Corinth. Constantine refused to abdicate but left with his eldest son for Switzerland. Now, overnight, the whole situation changed. Constantine was succeeded in Athens, now starving owing to the continuing blockade and virtually under French occupation, by his second son, Alexander. A few days later, Venizelos returned from Salonika with his government, received a warm welcome, and became the new king's prime minister, celebrating his reappointment with a 9-hour speech to Parliament. Now it was the royalists who suffered. Indeed, they were purged. Government, civil service, army, even the church. Greek society was torn in two and was to remain so for at least a generation. At last, and not a moment too soon, Greece entered the war on the Allied side. Her army, conscripted and largely untrained, fought magnificently in Macedonia. With the British, they invaded and defeated Bulgaria. With the French and Serbs, they drove the Germans out of Serbia. As a final triumph, Greek troops entered Constantinople for the first time since 1453. For Eleftherios Venizelos, it was his finest hour.